John, and we're in the second chapter. Follow along as I read this morning. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and there they stayed for a few days. And when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. The children are dismissed for Children's Church. I missed that. It looks like they got that part. Sorry about that. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all of them from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he'd said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the signs that he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He didn't need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. The film, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, was released this summer. It was about Fred Rogers, or Mr. Rogers, as many knew him. A whole generation of children grew up with seeing him on the PBS show. And at his funeral, numerous family and friends said, "There's no daylight between Fred Rogers and Mr. Rogers." The man who was on TV was exactly the same person in person. This gentle, kind, quiet, warm companion for children, that's who he really was. In an interview at one point that Fred had, and it took place at the television station, he offered to drive the interviewer home. It was rush hour, and it was a busy street in Pittsburgh, and he needed to make a left-hand turn. And the traffic was heavy, and they just waited and waited and waited. And Fred just commented, "The traffic is like this at this time of day." And his passenger said, "Don't you ever get frustrated?" And Fred was kind of quiet, and he said, Yes, sometimes I get frustrated, don't you?" And you could just hear him saying that. That's the same thing that Mr. Rogers would say to a child. This is exactly how many people see Jesus. They sort of think of him as Mr. Rogers. Jesus, gentle and kind. Jesus, meek and mild. In fact, many people, and perhaps you, this is the portrayal of Jesus that you received growing up in church. And it was often reinforced by pictures that adorned Sunday school rooms. There'd be Jesus with a bunch of little children around him, or Jesus would be holding a lamb in his arms. Jesus is mild. Jesus is meek. And so when we come to this passage, well, we're a bit shocked by what's going on here. We're a little bit put off. Jesus, beyond question, is upset here. He is angry here. He walks into the temple. He observes that animals are being sold, money is being exchanged, and he fashions a whip. Now, it's not a leather whip. His intent is not to injure anybody or anything. It's made of reeds. But he drives out the oxen and the sheep. He overturns the tables where the coins are spread for the exchange of money. He tells those who have doves, get them out of here. And Jesus is not meek and mild. In fact, he comes into the most public of places, the temple, at the busiest time of year, the Passover, and does this. Now, ordinarily, Jerusalem has about 60,000 people in it, give or take 10,000. But when Passover comes, the city swells to at least 250,000. Some people think it's significantly more than that. They gather, of course, to celebrate and remember God's deliverance of the people out of slavery, out of Egypt. And really was, for a Jewish person, the high point in their religious life. And of course, we wonder, why is it that Jesus behaves like this? What's got him so upset? But before we look at that, we need to look at who Jesus is. Now, we're in John's biography of Jesus, and Jesus is arguably the most significant person who's ever lived. He's had greater influence. He's shaped more things than anybody else in human history. And John wants you to see him and experience him as he himself did, so that you can make up your mind about the claims Jesus makes for himself. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at who Jesus is, and then why, what did he do, and then why it matters at all for us. Now, John has placed side by side two scenes. One is private. It's a wedding where Jesus does what his mother actually asked, and everybody, even though they don't know that he's done it, is very glad that he did it, that the wine continues to flow for the wedding feast. The other is public. It's at the temple where Jesus upsets the status quo. He acts, nobody asked him to do this. He simply goes in there and he does these things, and people are shocked. And they demand to know who he is, this carpenter, that he's doing this in the temple. In the one, we see that Jesus is concerned about this couple that's getting married, and he acts to rescue this celebration from the disaster of running out of wine. And in the other, Jesus is angry, and it's not too much to say that he's actually violent. He's not out of control. Don't get that picture. That wouldn't be true to what's happening here. He doesn't injure anybody or anything or any animals, but he does make a scene, and it gets everybody's attention. Now, John has already told us at the very beginning of this gospel that Jesus is co-creator with God the Father. And later, he'll tell us that Jesus will say this, that if you have seen me, you have seen God the Father. And the reason why we need to look at this closely is that Jesus mirrors the invisible God. He allows us to see what we otherwise could not see. Jesus makes visible the invisible God. And here's what we're seeing. That Jesus is not only kind and gentle, but that he's also angry about what's wrong. He gives expression to the very wrath of God here. Now, this word wrath is used a lot in the Bible. It's used to describe God, to describe his essential nature. Now, if I were to ask most of you, you would probably say that what you like about God the most and what you think of his essential nature is love. And that answer would be true as far as it goes. But the thing you need to appreciate about the love of God, it's not a sentimental kind of love. It is a love that has a settled opposition to evil, to what is wrong. It's not a love that's indifferent to violence, injustice, or wrongdoing. Now, this clashes with the picture that many people have of God in their minds. Many people will say something like this, I can't worship a God who gets angry. This God, this angry God, is the God of the Old Testament. It's not the God of the New Testament. You know, the people who knew Jesus, they knew he was just loving. And this stuff about God being angry, that's, well, Paul made that up, or other people who didn't know Jesus in his human form. And John is challenging this kind of thinking. Right as he begins his biography, he's challenging the way we would want to think of Jesus. He's challenging the way that we would like to imagine God to be, because actually we just want to project our own desires on God. We want a God that we can control, a God who will actually serve us. And John's challenging that. Now, God's wrath is unlike human wrath. Wrath's a strong word. It's a word that describes anger. Now, human wrath often looks like flying off the handle, like an outburst. It looks in an adult like a tantrum, looks like in a child. And that's not what God is like. God's wrath is not like human wrath. No, it's his settled, steady, unchanging opposition to evil and to sin and to all the effects that our sin creates, the distortions that it creates, the way it's a parasite and eats away at things, its corrosive effects. God simply will not leave evil present in his world. He won't leave human wickedness unchecked. He's going to remove it completely. He's going to banish evil. And the more your life has been touched by evil, the more you've been treated in an evil way by other human beings, the more you long, actually, for a world that's free of evil, a world where people don't get harmed, where wrongdoing doesn't take place. And after all, what kind of faith would it be to believe that there's a God who can exist passively in a world, our world where parents abuse their children, where dictators starve people to death for political gain, where murder, rape, there's senseless violence, where there's all manner of evil. Could a God who's only meek and mild actually satisfy the cry of our hearts for justice, for someone to right wrongs? And actually, you know this must be true. After all, what kind of person would you be if you were totally unmoved, if you watched a group of people assault an old person on the street? Could you watch that and say, oh, let's go over to Hy-Vee and have a cup of coffee now? Of course not. You really can't be like that. See, Jesus will return, and he will be revealed not only as Savior, but also as Judge. And the day he comes will be both a day of gladness and a day of gloom. And that should sober us. Because John's going to show us, and Jesus will say this repeatedly about himself, that Jesus is in fact the judge before whom we will all have to give an account. And John's pressing this right at the very beginning because he wants us to realize we have a decision to make. We have to decide whether Jesus is, in fact, who he claims to be. That each of us will have to give an account for how we've lived, what we've done, and what we say in this life. Now this brings us to, why is Jesus angry? What is it that's upset him here? Jesus enters the temple, and the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, is a marketplace. It resembles Broadway. There are shops and stalls, and people are bartering. That's how business is done. People in the ancient world, and still in many places today, they don't buy things at a fixed price. They haggle. And that's what's going on. There's the lowing of animals and there's haggling going on. Now, there's a couple things really important to understand about this scene. And the first is this, that Jews travel from all over the Roman Empire to come to Jerusalem. They come as far away as Spain and Italy. And it simply wasn't practical to bring an ox or a lamb with you all that distance. It just simply was necessary to buy your animals for sacrifice when you got to Jerusalem. And because people were coming from all over the empire, they would carry coins that weren't the kind that a pious Jew would want to carry in their pockets. Most of the coins in the empire bared the image of the emperor. And the emperor was viewed as a god, and worship of the emperor was mandated. Many of the early Christians, being forced to worship the emperor was the reason that they were thrown to the lions or otherwise met their death. And there would be on these coins other pagan symbols. And it's just inappropriate to bring these idols and pagan symbols into the temple to pay the temple tax. And so naturally there was a way to exchange them. This arrangement of selling animals and exchanging coins is perfectly fine. Jesus is not upset that these things are being done. He's not concerned that somehow there's price gouging taking place, that there's some sort of unethical business practice. If that were really the issue, he would have spoken to them about their greed. He would have challenged what they were doing in their business. But that's not what he's concerned about. No, what he says is get these out of here. In fact, these activities earlier, some years earlier, used to happen outside of the temple courts themselves. Jesus is angry because the very purpose for which the temple exists is being neglected and undermined. A marketplace has been set up in the outermost area called the Court of the Gentiles, and it's a large area that was intended for those who weren't fully Jewish to come and to worship. It was a place for them to approach God, to humble themselves, to seek mercy from him, as Solomon indicates in his prayer. It was a place for them to learn about God, to receive instruction from the scriptures. It was a place where they could commune with God, both in joyful song and quiet meditation. But instead, it's filled with the sounds of livestock and the clanging of coins and the haggling over all of that. And Jesus is zealous about this. In fact, the disciples remember the words of the prophet, that Jesus is zealous for his Father's house. He's zealous for the communion of people with God, because this is what his life's mission's all about. Now, to appreciate that, you really need to understand the purpose of the temple itself in God's plan. God's plan for humanity, the reason he created people was so that we might know him and we might enjoy him, that we ourselves might experience the deepest possible intimacy with him, an intimacy that's deeper than the very best of marriages. The best of marriages are just a shadow, or if you prefer, they're sort of an hors d'oeuvre of what really God intends for us to experience with himself. And you can see this theme of God wanting to dwell with human beings runs the whole length of the Bible. It begins in the book of Genesis. God creates a beautiful garden, and he sets Adam and Eve there, and we read that they walk with God in the cool of the day, like you might walk with a friend conversing. And Adam and Eve are there, and they are naked before God. Not just that they don't have clothing, but it means there's nothing within them that's hidden from God. There's this complete knowing of themselves by God, and there's no shame in that. There's nothing within them that embarrasses them in their relationship with God. But Adam and Eve didn't trust God, and as a result, there were consequences. And one of the consequences was they were banished from Eden. And the reason for that is this. They needed to understand that they're not trusting God radically changed everything for them. The things weren't normal. And so everything else changed. The whole of creation underwent a profound frustration and groaning. And so right away, we see that Abel is murdered by Cain. And we watch as we read the early chapters of the book of Genesis that violence grows. We see sexual immorality and perversion develop. We see human beings raise up a tower that is their effort to build a culture, a world that excludes God himself. And God doesn't just give up, though, on human beings. He begins a pursuit. That's the story of the Bible. He seeks out a man. He makes this childless man and his wife become parents, and in time, their family grows to a nation. When it's time for this nation to leave Egypt, God appears to Moses and instructs him to build a tabernacle, a tent in which God himself will dwell in the midst of his people. God's moving back toward his original purpose. And this tabernacle is built on a heavenly pattern. It reflects something eternal and spiritual. It's just a sign. It points beyond itself to something greater. A few more centuries pass, and it's time to build God a permanent house. And that house is the temple. The temple is where heaven meets earth. And in the center of the temple, in its inmost room, God himself has his throne. God has his feet in this place. It's a place where God himself is present. And the temple conveys two things that are seemingly contradictory. It does this simultaneously. So the temple is this amazingly beautiful, richly appointed. In fact, it's the largest structure of its kind in the ancient Near East. And it starts on the outermost parts with bronze. And then as you get closer to this central room, it's silver. And then the very central room is gold. And it's telling you with these metals that the most precious thing of all, the most valuable thing, is to be in the presence of God. And in fact, it in various ways has echoes of Eden. In the tapestries and in some of the ornaments, there are the fruits and the plants that represent the garden. The center of the temple is the garden. But at the same time, it shouts at you that you can't go there. You can't possibly get close to God. You had to offer a sacrifice to get anywhere near this place. And there is what we would call today layered security, like in a bank or like in a secure government facility. And in the most central vault, the place where God himself is, only one person can go there, only one time a year, and they need to be really careful about how they do it. Because, and everything in the temple screams this, is that God is holy and we are sinful, and God's holiness will break out against our sin. God is loving and holy and can't abide or brook evil. And to be in his presence for us is to be destroyed. And so the temple says, on the one hand, being in the presence of God is the greatest thing that you could ever experience in life. On the other hand, it says you can't go there. You can't really get close to God. And everything about the temple, the sacrifices, the priesthood, the building itself, contained reminders, intimations, hints that this wasn't a permanent arrangement, that this was flawed, that this would be replaced. And that's where Jesus comes in. Jesus has come to bring this passion of God to dwell with people and to change so that we can be. That's why John wrote at the beginning of his gospel, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word dwelt among us is literally tabernacled. God has come in the person of Jesus among us. And so Jesus is upset because the very purpose of the temple is being ignored and subverted. And Jesus himself will be consumed in his zeal for this house. Jesus himself will be consumed, meaning he will die on the cross in order to make it possible for us to be in the presence of God. Jesus is claiming here to have the authority to cleanse the temple. And the religious leaders want to know, well, what's the proof? And Jesus says something that's very cryptic. He says, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. Now the Jews are thinking that he's talking about Herod's temple, which is an enormous structure that took nearly 100 years to build. In fact, when this conversation's happened, it's not finished. It's going to take 30 more years for it to be completed. It won't be completed till AD 64. But Jesus doesn't mean that temple. He means the temple of his body, and that's why John makes these notes to clear this up for us. What's going on here is Jesus will be the ultimate sacrifice, and he will be the ultimate temple. He's saying the proof that this is so is his resurrection, that his body, which will be crucified, will be raised from the dead. And Christianity stands or falls with the resurrection. Either it happened or it didn't. And all of the preaching in the book of Acts, every one of the sermons ends with the announcement that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and therefore you need to repent because judgment is coming. All four of the Gospels record the events around Jesus' resurrection. The New Testament says the claims of Christ are proven by his resurrection, by the eyewitness testimony of the disciples to his resurrection. The disciples are in the best position to know whether this happened because they saw the empty tomb and they had numerous encounters with the resurrected Christ. These guys who were muddle-headed, confused, and in fact cowardly, especially as the hammer fell on Jesus, they all ran away from him. They became bold preachers of this, and it cost them. Through the whole of their lives, they suffered because they announced this truth, and it ultimately led to their deaths. And you not only have to explain, if this didn't happen, how that could be, but also why the Jewish authorities couldn't just shut down Christianity right at the beginning by showing that, in fact, Jesus was dead. One of the men who examined closely Jesus' claims, the New Testament's claims that Christ was raised from the dead, was a jurist, Simon Greenleaf. He's one of the founders of the Harvard School of Law. And he wrote a 3-volume work on the law of evidence, which is still the foundation for the practice of law in our courts today. And he decided that he would take his same approach that he developed for the courtroom and apply it to the Gospels to prove that Christianity wasn't true. And as he examined and looked at the evidence, he reached the conclusion that if this was unfolding in his court, that he would have to accept that the disciples were reliable eyewitnesses. And he became convinced that anyone who would actually look close at the evidence would be persuaded that, in fact, Jesus was raised from the dead. He published a book about it called The Testimony of the Evangelist, the Four Gospels, examined by the rule of evidence. And no one has ever been able to refute him. Why does this matter? What difference does this make? Well, simply put, Jesus' death is the end of all religion. God's incarnation as a man in the person of Jesus, this perfect sacrifice Jesus makes on the cross, is the sacrifice that ends all sacrifices. He creates perfect access to God. In the temple, in the inmost parts of it, from the holy place to the most holy place, a curtain hung. And when Jesus was dying on the cross, the moment he died, that curtain was torn in two. It announced that the way into the presence of God had been opened. And Jesus' resurrected body is now the perfect temple. And it means that the gospel's utterly different than all human religion. Mark Driscoll captures what I mean when he writes this. Religion says, if I obey, God will love me. The gospel says, because God loves me, I obey. Religion depends on what I do. Every religion requires you to do certain things to get close to God, to be accepted by God, to experience the ultimate experience you can have with God, whatever it is, enlightenment, paradise. But the gospel says it all depends on what Jesus has done. Religion has its goal to get something from God. That's why people make sacrifices. It's why people strike bargains. God, I will, whatever, if you only do this. That's why we do that. It's because we think that the way to get something is from God is to create this kind of bargain. That's the heart of all religions. But Christianity says that we, in fact, have as our goal getting God. Not getting something from God, but having God himself. Religion always leaves us with a sense of uncertainty about where we stand with God. Have we done enough? Is it enough? Could we ever actually do enough? And the gospel has certainty because it's based on Jesus' works. Religion causes either you to end up in pride or despair. Why pride? Well, because if you think you've done everything your religion requires, then you're better than everybody else. And if you haven't, it crushes you. You're in despair. But the gospel creates in us humble joy because we know that, in fact, we can't live the life God requires and that Jesus has done it for us. And so God never looks at our record to judge us again. So here's a few things, I should say, that flow from all of this. If you aren't yet convinced that Jesus has risen from the dead, then I want to encourage you just to investigate the Gospels. Just go ahead, and if you need someone to read with you, well, I'd be happy to read with you, or I'll find somebody who will read the Gospels with you if you have questions. The second thing this text should do is it should challenge the picture you have of God himself. Jesus is both kind and gentle and angry and intolerant of evil. His love has both sides to this. It's only whole when it has both sides of this. And so it may be that you need to repent of a kind of sentimental, kind of sappy love that doesn't confront evil, that doesn't confront evil that you create. Now, you can recognize whether this is in fact where you are by observing closely what happens at the end of this passage, where there's two kinds of faith talked about. There's the faith that the disciples have. They put their faith in Jesus and are receptive to the Scriptures. Now, their faith is partial at this point. They don't fully understand who Jesus is and what he's going to do. It's going to be for them like slowly turning up the lights in a room. And at times it's going to seem like for them the room is completely dark still. But there's another kind of faith. It's those who are only moved by signs, and their faith isn't in the person of Jesus. It's in his deeds and not who he is. And actually, there are many people who go to church who actually are in this second group. For them, faith is a way to use God. They come to church and say, I'll come to church as long as my needs are met. Ever hear anybody say that? I'll come to church as long as my needs are met. And you can tell whether this is happening in you by your deep heart response to both of these stories. At the wedding of Canaan and in the temple. You see, this is what the Christian life really looks like. At times, it's like the wedding. You ask for something and Jesus does it. And boy, that's wonderful, isn't it? And at other times, he comes into your life and he turns over your tables. He says, I have the authority to turn over the tables in your life. And of course, you want to know why. And, well, he has his reasons. And he may not tell you his reasons. In fact, he may hide his reasons from you altogether. The reason might simply be this, that he's your creator and redeemer, and he has a right to do this. And you wouldn't understand his reasons even if he explained it beyond that. You see, it's your ability to submit to the authority of the person of Christ that's really the telltale of whether your faith is real faith in him as a person. Here's the last point, the last application, because a lot of you are very involved in New Life and have given yourself really to extraordinary efforts as we've been launching. And it's real easy for you to become so busy with the life of the church, so busy serving God, that you don't actually commune with him. We're about to come to this table. It's called communion. and Jesus speaks to us about it. He says, this is my body and this is my blood. The blood of Christ is the atoning sacrifice. The blood is the thing that represents the whole costly sacrifice that Jesus has made so that we can be in the presence of God. Of course, this table is still not the full experience of the presence of God that awaits us. That's coming in the new heavens and the new earth. And the body, yes, Jesus says, this is my body broken for you, but it points to Jesus as the only way to have access to God, the only way to connect with the Creator and Redeemer, to the God who actually is pursuing us. And so I want to encourage you to come to him in these moments. And for some of you, that means you need to lay down your deadly doing. You've just simply got to realize that your relationship with God is not based on how much you do or how well you do it. It's not based on how much service you have or how well you carry out some role in your life as parent, wife, husband, sister, brother, neighbor, your work. No, it rests on what Jesus has done. And come and enjoy the sweetness of that here this morning.